The angels, creatures of light, born to uphold the order of the world. They stand at the edge of eternity. The keepers of divine law. The guardians of the earth from above. Pure, steadfast, eternal. But then, they look down. And that glimpse opens the sky. They see women. Not angels. Not queens. Just mortal women, fragile, ephemeral, human. And in their softness, the angels find a fire they cannot extinguish. The desire to be born in wings that have never known weight. Love, or something, began to gnaw at immortal hearts. And then, they fell. Not like the stars, but like kings who renounced their thrones for darkness. They came to earth, took wives, and from those forbidden marriages emerged the Nephilim. Giants of blood and blasphemy. Not angels. Not men. They were power but not mercy. And their hunger knew no end. They walked like gods, but left destruction in their wake. They consumed fields, flocks, and finally men. The heavens watched. And God was sad. For the world he had called good was now choking with a legacy born of lust and rebellion. And so the flood came. Not in wrath, but in regret. The waters rose, wiping out what should never have been. Giants drowned. Cities vanished. Even sinning angels were chained to darkness. But the story does not end there. For some things survived the flood. Things not made of flesh or bone, but of memory. Women. Wives of angels. Mothers of monsters. They loved what heaven forbade. And now they stand in the silence of a cleansed world, marked by a sin they can no longer name, and a judgment still waiting to fall. This is their story. A story buried not in scripture, but in whispers. A love that defies heaven's law, and a punishment that outlasts the flood. Are you ready to remember what the world was told to forget? Part 1, the first look that shattered heaven. They were not created to feel, not to crave, not to fall. The angels, heaven's firstborn, were made of light, purpose, and obedience. They did not hunger. They did not doubt. They existed to worship, to guard, to sing. Emotion had no place in their design. Desire had no voice in their being. But even heaven is not immune to a crack. One day, the watchers, those appointed to observe the earth, cast their gaze downward. What they saw was not sin, not war, not chaos. They saw women. Not queens, not priestesses, but women of the soil. Mothers, daughters, dreamers. Imperfect. Mortal. And yet, so unbearably beautiful in their fragility. It wasn't the kind of beauty the angels knew. It wasn't the radiance of stars or the harmony of celestial song. It was beauty wrapped in pain. Strength veiled in softness. A kind of glory that could die. And that made it irresistible. Have you ever wondered what makes the forbidden so enticing? It wasn't touch that doomed the angels. It wasn't words. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was a look. A single glance. That was all it took. In that moment, something shifted in the realm of eternity. For the first time in creation, the divine hesitated. They did not turn away. They kept looking. Again. And again. Curiosity became fascination. Fascination became longing. Longing became the seed of their fall. And here, we must ask a terrible question. If even angels, creatures formed by the breath of God, can be undone by a glance, what hope is there for us? Are we weaker? Or were we always the temptation heaven never saw coming? Because perhaps the greatest danger was never in what we did, but in how we were seen. The first sin was not a bite from a fruit, but a stare from the sky. Part 2, The Oath of 200 Angels. They say angels cannot lie. But what about when they swear an oath, against heaven itself? The watchers, the ones who first gazed too long, who first felt the tremor of forbidden love. They knew the law. They knew the cost. Desire alone is not a crime. But stepping down from eternity to touch the earth, that was treason. And still, they chose to fall. Not blindly. Not by accident. But together. 200 of them, divine beings of unimaginable radiance, gathered beneath the shadow of Mount Hermon. And there, they made a vow. One would not fall alone. If they were to leave their place, they would do so united. Each of them would take a wife from among mankind. Each of them would taste the sweetness of mortal intimacy. And if judgment came, it would come for them all. It was not a pact of love. It was a pact of fear. They feared the wrath of the Almighty. But they feared isolation more. So they bound themselves together, swearing by all that was once holy in them, to descend. In that moment, the heavens did not thunder. The stars did not fall. The earth did not shake. It was quiet, as if all of creation held its breath. Because something irreversible had just occurred. Heaven's guardians had become conspirators. They weren't cast down like Lucifer. They walked down, willingly. And the moment their feet touched the soil, the world would never be the same. And so, we ask, when divine beings forsake their place, is it truly love? Or is it hunger in disguise? Was it destiny? Or the first organized rebellion of desire? And more chilling still, what if they succeeded not because they were angels, but because the women said yes? The oath of the 200 wasn't just the beginning of the fall. It was the moment heaven lost its monopoly on loyalty. Part 3, The Women Who Were Chosen. They had no idea they were being watched. No voice whispered warnings. No prophet cried out in the streets. No star fell from the sky. The women lived their lives as they always had. Baking bread, tending fields, humming lullabies into the wind. And somewhere above, angels listened. They didn't choose at random. The 200 watched for the brightest spirits. The kindest eyes. The ones whose laughter echoed like water. Whose presence stirred something even heaven could not name. These women were not seductresses. They were not witches or rebels. They were simply human. And that was enough. One by one, the angels approached them. Not with violence, not with force, but with wonder. They came in beauty. They came in light. They came with promises no mortal man could match. Secrets of the stars. Language of beasts. The knowledge of metal and root and sky. And the women. They listened. Some were flattered. Some were frightened. But some felt seen for the first time in their lives. And they said yes. Yes to the angel who spoke their name like a song. Yes to the one whose touch was warmth and mystery. Yes to the impossible. But what did they truly say yes to? They believed it was love. But love without boundaries becomes possession. And affection from a fallen thing always carries a price. So we ask, were these women chosen for their beauty? Or because they were vulnerable? Did they fall in love with angels? Or with the idea that they were finally more than dust and bone? What happens when the divine stares at you like you matter? And you believe it? Some say the angels seduced them. Others say the women welcomed the fall. But perhaps the truth lies in between. In that gray place where desire blurs into fate. And heaven watches in silence. Part 4, The Birth of the Nephilim, the Giant Children. They were not meant to exist. The union of angel and woman, of spirit and flesh, was never written into the divine order. There were no rules for what would be born from a love that broke heaven's law. And yet, they were born. Not small, not fragile, but immense. The Nephilim. Giants in form, but something far more terrifying in essence. They were strength without balance, power without mercy, wisdom without restraint. From the moment they drew breath, the world began to tremble. They grew faster than time, taller than trees, hungrier than any beast that walked before them. And they were not merely brutes. They could speak. They could plan. They could rule. They inherited the divine intellect of their fathers, and the burning emotion of their mothers. But they lacked one crucial thing: conscience. Imagine a child who can crush a boulder with one hand. Now imagine that child throwing a tantrum. And imagine an entire generation of them, ruling over men like gods with no patience. They devoured everything: fields, livestock, cities. And when food ran out, they devoured mankind. The book of Enoch says, "They consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind." This wasn't myth. It was warning. A creation out of balance will always collapse into destruction. And so the world cried out. Mothers hid their children. Men fled from their own land. Terror became the new sky. And all the while, the angels who fathered them stood helpless, watching their sons consume the world. So we must ask, what is born when love defies heaven? What grows in the soil of rebellion and desire? The Nephilim were not simply giants. They were echoes of a mistake no one dared to name. And their footsteps shook the ground, until even heaven could no longer look away. Part 5, The Great Flood, the Final Judgment. At first, it came as silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that arrives before something ancient awakens. The air stilled. The animals stopped. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath. Heaven had watched long enough. The cries of the innocent rose like smoke. And God, slow to anger, yet bound by justice, heard them all. The world was no longer what he had called good. It had become twisted, drowned in blood, bent by desire. Giants ruled. Humans hid. Angels wept. And somewhere in the center of it all, the women stood alone, torn between love and ruin. But judgment doesn't always come with fire. This time, it came with rain. Not a cleansing drizzle. Not a gentle storm. But rain that fell like morning turned liquid. Heavy. Endless. Relentless. The heavens broke open, and the deep places of the earth erupted. The flood was not rage. It was grief weaponized. It was sorrow so deep it drowned mountains. The Nephilim, those untouchable titans, found themselves powerless. They climbed hills, then mountains, then begged the sky. But no height could save them. Their voices, once thundering with command, now cried like frightened children. The earth itself rejected them, swallowing their footprints beneath rising tides. And the angels who had once defied the throne of heaven could only watch, bound between worlds, chained in spiritual darkness, their children vanishing into the waters below. But what of the women? The flood did not spare them. And yet, some did not die. Not in body. But what about soul? Can survival be a mercy? When everything you love has drowned, can you wake up to a world washed clean? and still feel unclean. This was not just a flood. It was a divine reckoning. A reset. A declaration that some boundaries, once crossed, demand a price too heavy for even the angels to carry. And still, beneath the waves, some stories refuse to be buried. Because when the rain stopped, and the sun returned, something else began. The giants were gone. The angels were in chains. But the women, the wives, they remained. And heaven had not forgotten them. Part 6, Michael's mission beyond the flood. The giants had fallen. The earth had swallowed their bones. The flood receded, and with it, the age of chaos. But justice was not yet complete. Because something still lingered. Not in the skies. Not in the waters. But in the hearts of the women who had loved the fallen. They stood in silence on a scarred and empty earth. No husbands. No children. No future. Just memory. And memory is a kind of prison. Some wept until their voices cracked. Some collapsed in grief. Others, like Nama, stood proud, untouched by remorse. She had once turned heads even in the presence of angels. Her beauty had stirred the stars. But after the flood, she wore her guilt like silk. Not in shame, but in defiance. She did not beg heaven for forgiveness. She looked up at it, and smiled. But heaven did not forget. And heaven does not bargain. So God sent the one angel who does not flinch. The sword of divine wrath. The general of the celestial host. Michael. He did not come to speak. He did not come to comfort. He came to finish what had been started. His mission was not one of war, but of reckoning. Because these women, though mortal, had crossed into a place no human was ever meant to go. They had joined their hearts to beings outside of time. They had birthed abominations. And though the world now floated clean beneath a new sky, their souls still echoed with the song of rebellion. Michael was not sent to kill them. He was sent to judge them. And that judgment was transformation. Part 7, The Sirens, Beauty Reborn as Curse. Heaven could have turned them to ash. Could have silenced them with thunder. But God, in His justice, often chooses poetry over fire. And so, the punishment was not death, but memory. The women who had lain with angels, who had cradled Nephilim in their arms, were not erased. They were remade. Not into monsters. Not into demons. But into warnings. Sirens. Half woman, half creature. Forever beautiful. Forever mournful. And forever cursed. Their voices, once filled with lullabies, now carried a different music. Songs that called ships to ruin. And hearts to break. They remained radiant, achingly so. Their eyes shimmered like the sea before a storm. Their laughter stirred the wind. But all of it was poison. Not because they desired to harm, but because their very presence was a reminder of love unblessed, of desire unbridled, of what happens when divine boundaries are broken. Imagine being adored forever, but never held, desired by all, but loved by none. To sing a song you cannot stop, knowing each note lures another soul to ruin. That was their fate. The worst punishment wasn't their transformation. It was that they remembered. Every glance. Every whisper. Every choice that led the world into flood. Some went mad, hearing the cries of drowned children echo in their dreams. Others walked the shores in silence, hollowed by grief no ocean could drown. And yet, to mortals, they seemed divine. Men chased them, Poets dreamed of them. Sailors died for them. But no one ever saved them. Because they could not be saved. They were not just myth. They were memory with a body. Judgment with a voice. The ancient texts speak of them not as monsters, but as wandering stars, for whom blackest darkness has been reserved forever. So now, when you hear of sirens singing from the rocks, remember, they are not singing to seduce. They are singing because they cannot forget. Part 8, The Watchers Who Remained Faithful. Not all angels fell. When desire swept through heaven like a silent plague, some stood firm. They turned their gaze away from the earth, closed their hearts to temptation, and held their place. They were not louder. They were not stronger. But they were unwavering. And for that, they were entrusted with something sacred. After the flood, after the sirens were born and the fallen were bound, these faithful ones were given a new purpose. Not to sing, not to guard gates, but to watch. They became the quiet sentinels of a wounded world, keepers of memory, observers of mankind, witnesses to the scars no water could wash away. They did not interfere. They were not sent to correct. Their task was harder. They had to remember. They saw the sirens haunting the coasts, their songs weaving sorrow into the tides. They watched the children of Noah rebuild the earth, tilling soil still heavy with the ghosts of giants. They listened to the stories whispered by fires, tales of creatures too large to be real, and women too beautiful to be forgotten. And though time wore down the edges of those memories, the watchers remembered perfectly, because they had seen the cost of rebellion, not just in war, but in the soft tragedy of one glance gone too far. They stood at the edge of glory, not with weapons drawn, but with silence heavy in their wings. They knew now. Some love is not meant to be. Some knowledge, not meant to be shared. Some boundaries, not meant to be touched. And so, they remained. Not cold. Not distant. But reverent. Heaven had bled once. It would not bleed again. Part 9, The Echo That Still Remains. The floodwaters receded. The Nephilim are gone. The angels are chained beneath darkness. The sirens drift like sorrow along forgotten shores. And yet, it didn't end. Because some things don't drown. They echo. A song. A story. A wound too deep for time to seal. Every culture remembers them, though the names have changed. The Greeks called them muses or monsters. The Hebrews spoke of watchers and giants. The sailors heard voices on the wind, and blamed the sea. But beneath the myth, the memory remains. Have you ever met someone whose beauty unsettled you? Not because of desire, but because of something ancient. Have you ever felt watched, as if the sky itself was holding its breath? Some say the children of the Nephilim left traces, bloodlines that burn with strange fire. Others say the sirens still sing to those who carry sorrow too deep for words. And in secret places, some whisper that not all of the 200 were caught, that a few still walk among us. Quiet, radiant, haunted. But the most terrifying echo is not found in the sea or in the sky. It is in us. Because we still don't know what to do with desire. We still chase things we shouldn't. Love what we can't hold. Break what we swore to protect. The first sin was not rebellion. It was longing. One glance. One ache. And that same ache lives in us. So the question remains. If even angels can fall, what hope is there for us? perhaps none. Or perhaps the hope lies in remembering. Not to fear beauty, but to respect it. Not to silence desire, but to test it. Because the echo still sings. In lullabies. In waves. In dreams. And in those moments when you feel the old world calling through your blood, ask yourself, is it love? Or is it a shadow in disguise? Because somewhere, far from here, beneath ruins the flood could not reach, the sirens are still singing. And they remember you.